The sun rose over the Jamaican landscape, its light spilling across sugarcane fields that stretched endlessly, hiding the anguish beneath their swaying green. At first glance, the plantation seemed idyllic, a promise of wealth and productivity, yet beneath this veneer lay a world carved from cruelty and despair. The air was thick with humidity, sweat, and the ever-present scent of cane being crushed for sugar, mingling with the metallic tang of fear that seemed to hang perpetually over the laboring enslaved. Each day began before dawn, with the shrill crack of the overseer's whip cutting through the morning mist, calling men, women, and children to toil without respite. From the early hours, enslaved workers labored under the oppressive sun, bent over rows of sugarcane, their hands raw, their backs scarred from previous punishments. The cane itself was unforgiving, slicing skin with sharp edges, yet it was the overseer's cruelty that left the deepest wounds. Whips, sticks, and iron tools were instruments not of work, but of control, maintaining a terror so complete that any thought of resistance had to be carefully buried, hidden behind weary eyes and bowed heads. Families were torn apart with little notice, children separated from mothers, spouses sold to distant estates, and human lives reduced to property and labor. The psychological toll was immense. Whispered prayers in secret corners, fleeting glances exchanged across the fields, and the quiet sharing of forbidden hope were all that reminded the enslaved of their humanity. Amid this oppression, the landscape itself played a role in survival and subterfuge. Beyond the open fields lay thick forests, tangled with vines, towering trees, and dark underbrush. These forests were simultaneously a place of fear and sanctuary. The colonial authorities viewed them as wild, untamed, and dangerous, but for the enslaved, they offered a fragile glimmer of autonomy. In the shadows of these trees, fugitives could vanish, leaving only footprints that would soon be obscured by the heavy rain or shifting earth. The forests became a living character in the narrative of rebellion, silent, watchful, and protective for those brave enough to seek refuge within their depths. Streams and hidden groves offered water and sustenance, but also concealed predators and the dangers of the unknown. Every step into the woods was a gamble, a test of courage and ingenuity, yet the promise of even temporary freedom drove many to take that risk. Life on the plantations was a paradox of extremes. While the enslaved endured unimaginable suffering, the plantation owners and overseers lived in conspicuous wealth. Great houses rose on manicured grounds, their walls adorned with European furnishings, the aroma of fine cooking wafting from kitchens staffed by the very people they enslaved. Servants moved with quiet efficiency, attending to the comforts of their masters while the sun scorched the fields beyond. This contrast between oppression and indulgence created a tension so stark it seemed almost theatrical, a stage where human suffering and arrogance were juxtaposed against one another in cruel perfection. The very wealth that enslaved labor produced became a symbol of their bondage, a daily reminder of the power imbalance and injustice embedded in every facet of plantation life. The social structure on these estates was rigid and unforgiving. Overseers were not just enforcers of labor, but embodiments of terror. Their authority was absolute, and their cruelty calculated. Reports of punishments were public and brutal, often designed to instill fear in others. A single act of defiance could result in mutilation, imprisonment, or death, leaving a chilling lesson for anyone who dared imagine freedom. Yet, beneath the fear, the enslaved quietly observed, learned, and adapted. They discovered patterns in overseers' routines, weaknesses in the plantation's defenses, and opportunities to resist in ways that could remain hidden. These small acts of subversion, sabotaging tools, slowing work intentionally, or secretly communicating messages, were the first sparks of rebellion, tiny flames threatening to ignite a much larger fire. Cultural and familial bonds provided resilience amid this cruelty. Despite efforts to strip away identity and connection, enslaved communities maintained traditions, folklore, and spiritual practices that nourished their souls. Music, drumming, and whispered stories of distant African homelands became more than entertainment. They were acts of survival, anchors of identity, and subtle tools of defiance. Within these gatherings, elders shared wisdom about escape, survival, and endurance. Children learned lessons of caution and courage, watching elders navigate a world of violence with quiet intelligence. These moments of shared humanity were fragile but crucial, offering hope that survival and resistance were possible even under the harshest oppression. The geographic isolation of many plantations further exacerbated the enslaved population's vulnerability. Estates were spread across vast tracts of land, with some located miles from the nearest settlement. This isolation intensified the sense of entrapment, creating an environment where escape seemed nearly impossible. Yet, it also provided opportunities for planning and plotting that could remain unnoticed by the unobservant overseer. The enslaved learned to read the land, noticing secret paths, hidden water sources, and natural shelters. This intimate knowledge of their environment would later become instrumental in the survival strategies employed during acts of revolt. At the same time, the political and economic pressures of the colonial system weighed heavily on both masters and enslaved. The sugar trade was a cornerstone of the empire, demanding maximum output, often at the expense of human life. Plantation owners lived in fear of economic loss, disease outbreaks, and rebellion, while the enslaved navigated the perilous balance between obedience and survival. Any whisper of revolt could trigger panic, harsher punishments, or mass crackdowns, reinforcing the pervasive climate of fear. Yet, in this pressure cooker of brutality and injustice, ideas of freedom, revenge, and justice began to ferment quietly in the minds of those who had nothing left to lose. By the time the story of the revolt begins, tension had reached a fever pitch. The enslaved were pushed to their physical and psychological limits, their resilience tested daily by unrelenting cruelty. Yet, within the confines of this terror, seeds of defiance took root. The contrast between the lush, oppressive beauty of the landscape, the opulence of the plantation owners, and the suffering of the enslaved created a setting ripe for revolt. It was a world where hope and horror intertwined, where the promise of freedom existed only in whispers and hidden paths, and where the courage to resist could alter the course of history forever. The fire of rebellion begins not with action, but with thought, quietly stirring in minds shaped by years of cruelty and survival. Among the enslaved on the Jamaican plantations, there were those who observed the patterns of oppression, who understood the rhythms of fear that the overseers relied upon to maintain control. These individuals were more than victims. They were strategists, thinkers, and, in their own way, visionaries. They listened to whispered tales of distant uprisings, stories of slaves who had dared to strike back, and the legends of African ancestors who had resisted conquest and enslavement. These narratives planted seeds of defiance, offering not just inspiration, but a blueprint for rebellion. They learned that survival required cunning, patience, and an intimate knowledge of both human nature and the landscape around them. The leaders of this revolt were ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances, yet their minds carried extraordinary resolve. Some were skilled laborers. Others were domestics who had seen the inner workings of the plantation household and knew the vulnerabilities of their masters. They observed patterns of indulgence, moments when guards were distracted, when overseers relaxed their vigilance, and when opportunities to act quietly emerged. Their intelligence was honed in secrecy, communicated through subtle gestures, coded words, and hidden gatherings that appeared innocent to the untrained eye. Even in the face of constant surveillance and brutal punishment, these enslaved individuals nurtured the audacity to think beyond mere survival, to imagine a moment when they could reclaim power, if only briefly. Central to their strategy was the use of poison, a silent and insidious weapon that could strike fear and chaos without the immediacy of open combat. Knowledge of herbs, roots, and concoctions was passed down through generations, often tied to African traditions and secret teachings that had survived the Middle Passage. The leaders understood the delicate balance of timing and dosage, how a single drop could change the course of life and death on the plantation. Preparing for the revolt required meticulous planning, testing substances discreetly, calculating the movements of their targets, and coordinating with others in a network of trust that could not fail. One betrayal, one misstep, could result in torture or execution, Yet they pressed forward, driven by a mix of desperation, righteous anger, and the faint glimmer of liberation. Their motivations were multifaceted. There was anger, deep, visceral anger at years of cruelty and humiliation. There was grief for lost family members, stolen children, and the countless friends who had died under the sun or at the hands of the whip. But there was also hope, a fragile, flickering hope that justice, however momentary, could be enacted. These leaders were acutely aware that their revolt would not be without cost, that the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. Yet the moral imperative to resist outweighed the fear of death. The psychological landscape they navigated was treacherous, a tightrope between courage and madness, between pragmatism and passion. Every decision had weight, every moment was a test of nerve, and every interaction could either sow security or betrayal. Secrecy was paramount. The enslaved leaders devised covert methods of communication, from subtle hand signals in the fields to nighttime meetings hidden beneath the cover of dense forest canopy. They learned to read one another's expressions, noticing tension, doubt, or readiness, and adapted their plans accordingly. Trust was the most valuable currency, yet it was also the rarest. Any misstep could be fatal, but the bonds forged in this crucible of oppression created a sense of unity and shared purpose that became the foundation of their daring plan. This network extended beyond immediate collaborators, encompassing sympathetic allies who could provide information, shelter, or provisions when the revolt began. The narrative of their minds also reflects a darker, more personal struggle. The enslaved had been conditioned to obedience, yet to plan murder, no matter how justified, was a terrifying inversion of the world they had known. There was hesitation, fear, and moments of doubt. Could they carry out the poisonings without detection? Would their fellow slaves remain loyal when confronted with the reality of bloodshed? These leaders wrestled not only with external danger, but with their own morality, reconciling the violence required for liberation with the humanity that had been systematically stripped from them. This internal conflict adds layers to their character, transforming them from simple rebels into complex, psychologically compelling figures whose courage is intertwined with fear and self-reflection. Historical context amplifies their ingenuity. Caribbean slave societies were constantly on edge, aware of the fragility of the social order. The leaders of this revolt were aware that revolts had occurred before, that punishments had been extreme, and yet, knowledge of past successes and failures informed every decision. They understood that rebellion was a dangerous but sometimes necessary assertion of humanity in a system designed to crush it entirely. They measured risks, anticipated retaliation, and leveraged both fear and the element of surprise to maximize their chances of success. Each choice was deliberate, each movement calculated, and the meticulousness of their planning underscores the intelligence and audacity required to challenge an entrenched, brutal system. Ultimately, the seeds of rebellion were not just ideas. They were living, breathing strategies, nurtured in secret and poised to erupt. The enslaved leaders embodied a paradoxical blend of caution and boldness, terror and resolve, intelligence and desperation. They waited for the moment when conditions aligned, when guards were vulnerable, when supplies could be acquired, when opportunity allowed the silent administration of poison. This section of their story is less about the act itself and more about the preparation, the human psychology behind daring defiance, and the emotional stakes that would drive them to commit acts that would echo through history. The audience begins to sense that these individuals, though seemingly powerless, carry a force capable of shaking the very foundations of the plantation system. The tension builds, not from immediate action, but from the anticipation, the mental acrobatics, and the courage simmering beneath the surface. By the end of this section, viewers understand that the revolt is not a spontaneous eruption of violence, but a carefully nurtured storm, gathering strength in the minds of those who refuse to remain broken, who dare to challenge an oppressive world, and who are willing to risk everything for even a fleeting taste of freedom. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as though the sun itself was wary of witnessing the violence about to unfold. The enslaved had moved with meticulous care, their plans honed over months of whispered meetings, hidden signals, and clandestine practice. Each leader carried the weight of their people's suffering, the memory of injuries inflicted, families torn apart, and nights spent in terror under the overseer's watchful eyes. Their hands trembled not only with fear, but with the knowledge that a single mistake could mean death for themselves, and perhaps even more horrific reprisals for those who remained on the plantation. Every glance toward the master's houses, every sound of distant footsteps, was a test of nerve. The poison was prepared with precision, its effects known from careful experimentation and oral tradition. Bitter, pungent, almost untraceable, it was to be administered subtly, slipped into cups or meals with the kind of quiet cunning that only desperation and intelligence could produce. The enslaved leaders understood that their strength lay not in brute force, but in stealth and timing. Each act had to be calculated, every overseer's routine studied, every guard's movements memorized. The tension was suffocating. Any oversight could unravel everything. The forested periphery of the estate, once a place of whispered hope, now seemed to breathe with anticipation, as if even the land itself sensed the coming upheaval. Morning unfolded like any other, the plantation's rhythm unchanged in appearance, but the air was thick with an invisible charge. Slaves moved about their duties, pretending compliance while hearts pounded with anticipation. Children ran to fetch water, women carried bundles of linen, men bent over the cane. Yet beneath these ordinary motions lay the invisible threads of a deadly plan. The leaders exchanged subtle glances, small nods, a coded touch on an arm, signaling that the moment had come. Every participant understood the stakes, and yet there was a strange, almost electric exhilaration in the air, a recognition that their courage would be measured in acts few could ever fathom. When the poison took effect, it was swift and silent, a ghostly hand striking from the shadows. Overseers began to falter, sweating, shaking, their faces contorted in confusion and pain. Those who recognized the symptoms too late clutched at their throats, collapsing under the sun they had wielded as a weapon for so long. Chaos rippled through the plantation, and for a moment, the enslaved could move unbound, even if only fleetingly, as the tyrants who had tormented them writhed helplessly. The act was not just revenge, it was a declaration of defiance, a statement that cruelty, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be challenged. Panic ensued as the surviving overseers scrambled to understand the inexplicable illness, their authority crumbling in the face of unseen sabotage. Guards ran through the fields, shouting and swinging whips, but the enslaved were already moving, hidden in plain sight, slipping between the cane and through narrow paths they alone knew. There was a surreal quality to the scene, a cinematic juxtaposition of order unraveling into chaos, a fear consuming those who had once wielded it. Every movement, every breath, became an act of strategy. The leaders guided their fellow slaves, ensuring that no one panicked beyond reason, that their plan did not dissolve in the torrent of terror. The revolt's immediacy heightened the psychological tension for all involved. The enslaved experienced a surge of adrenaline, their minds racing as they calculated the next steps, which paths led to safety, which areas were still under threat, and how to remain unseen while advancing toward their objectives. The psychological impact on the overseers was profound. Those who had enforced punishment without thought now confronted mortality and helplessness. The terror they had inflicted for so long was mirrored back at them, a chilling reflection of their own brutality. This reversal of power, though temporary, sent ripples through the social fabric of the plantation, marking the beginning of an upheaval that would not be easily forgotten. Despite the initial success, the enslaved were not free from danger. Some overseers survived the poisoning, their anger intensified by the unexpected strike. Armed militias and loyalist slaves quickly mobilized to restore control, hunting the rebels with lethal intent. The leaders understood that the revolt's window was narrow. They had moments to escape, to vanish into the protective cover of forests and hidden paths before retribution could claim them. Every second counted, every decision could alter life or death, and the tension mounted to near unbearable levels. The air was electric with suspense, every footstep a potential threat, every shadow a potential ally or enemy. The revolt, though small in scale, sent shockwaves through the plantation. Its psychological and symbolic significance outweighed its numerical impact. It revealed that oppression, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be challenged with intelligence, courage, and strategic daring. For the enslaved, the act was a fleeting taste of empowerment, a dangerous but intoxicating glimpse of autonomy. For the overseers and owners, it was a stark reminder that fear could not be indefinitely imposed, that the human spirit could erupt in ways neither brutality nor wealth could suppress. In these moments, the leaders displayed a remarkable blend of pragmatism and audacity. While chaos reigned, they ensured their own safety and that of their closest allies. They understood that survival meant more than defiance. It required planning the next phase, fleeing into terrain they had long studied, and maintaining the cohesion of their group under extreme pressure. Every movement, from the administration of poison to the retreat into cover, demonstrated a careful orchestration that combined intellect, courage, and intimate knowledge of their environment. By the day's end, the plantation had been transformed. The overseers who had once wielded unchecked power were either dead, incapacitated, or driven to panic. The enslaved had asserted their agency, if only temporarily, and the forest beyond awaited those who dared to vanish into its protective shadows. The revolt, silent and cunning, had already begun to rewrite the rules of fear and control. What had begun as whispered plans in secret corners of the plantation had erupted into an unforgettable, terrifying, and profoundly human assertion of defiance, a story that would echo long after the fields had quieted once more. The moment the revolt succeeded, the enslaved leaders knew that their survival depended on disappearing into the dense, unwelcoming wilderness beyond the plantation. The forest, which had once been a place of whispered hope and secret gatherings, now became a sanctuary and a battlefield all at once. Every step into the undergrowth was measured, deliberate, as if the very trees could betray them if they faltered. They moved silently, slipping past fallen logs, tangled roots, and thorny brush, guided by an intimate knowledge of the land that only those who labored under the sun and feared the whip could possess. The forest was their ally and their adversary. It offered concealment, water, and game, but it also demanded vigilance against hidden predators, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present danger of discovery. The leaders split their group into small, manageable units, understanding that a large party would be easily spotted and hunted. Communication became subtle. Hand signals, barely audible whispers, and prearranged signs carved into tree bark guided their movements. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, was reason to freeze, to listen, to assess the threat before moving. Their bodies ached from exhaustion, yet adrenaline and fear sharpened their senses. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and thirst pressed at their mouths, yet the imperative to survive, to escape capture, outweighed every physical discomfort. The forest itself became a character in their story, both protective and demanding, a labyrinth in which every choice could mean life or death. As they fled, they were acutely aware of the plantation militia and loyalist slaves who would be scouring the land. The authorities had quickly realized the revolt was no accident, and their pursuit was swift, merciless, and coordinated. Mounted riders patrolled obvious paths, while foot soldiers combed underbrush and riverbanks, leaving few stones unturned. Informants were everywhere. Even the smallest act of misplaced trust could betray a hiding place. The leaders had anticipated these dangers, selecting routes that took advantage of natural barriers, steep ravines, dense thickets, and winding streams that obscured footprints. Knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage, but the constant pressure of pursuit made every night a tense gamble and every shadow a potential threat. Survival required more than stealth. It demanded ingenuity and courage. They constructed makeshift shelters using branches, leaves, and mud, camouflaging themselves from view while remaining near sources of food and water. They hunted small animals, fished in streams, and foraged for edible plants, balancing nutrition against the risk of exposure. The leaders taught their companions how to move silently, how to read the signs of predators and humans alike, and how to endure discomfort with discipline. Every day in the forest became a test of endurance, willpower, and the relentless application of knowledge that could mean life or death. Amid this struggle, moments of fear and doubt were inevitable. Exhausted bodies stumbled, tempers frayed, and despair threatened to take hold. Yet the leaders remained resolute, offering reassurance, direction, and reminders of why they risked everything. They invoked memories of stolen families, of friends who had perished under the overseer's hands, and of the fleeting taste of autonomy they had briefly experienced during the revolt. These reminders were more than motivational. They were lifelines, threads of resolve that held the group together as the dangers of exposure and starvation loomed large. The forest also forced the enslaved to confront the raw realities of human nature under pressure. Trust became both precious and precarious. Small disagreements could escalate into dangerous distractions, while cautious cooperation was the difference between being caught and remaining free. Every action was scrutinized, every choice weighed. Leaders often faced moral dilemmas, whether to risk a diversion for food, how to treat the sick or injured among them, and whether to trust a rumored safe passage offered by sympathetic outsiders. The psychological toll was immense, yet the shared purpose and communal experience forged a bond that transcended fear. The natural environment played a critical role in shaping their experience. Torrential rain could wash away tracks, but also make movement treacherous. Swollen rivers became obstacles that required careful planning to cross, and nights brought cold, insects, and the haunting calls of nocturnal predators. Yet the forest also offered protection. Dense canopies shielded them from aerial reconnaissance. Valleys masked their approach, and natural caves or groves provided temporary shelter from the relentless pursuit. The enslaved learned to read the land as if it were a living map, each feature offering both opportunity and warning. Even as the forest offered a haven, the threat of betrayal loomed large. Plantation authorities offered rewards for information, and the enslaved knew that desperation or fear could turn allies into informants. Every interaction with strangers was fraught with risk, and every decision to move or remain hidden could alter their fate. Yet the leaders' strategic brilliance and careful planning allowed them to navigate these perils with remarkable success, using misdirection, decoy paths, and hidden encampments to evade capture. As the days stretched into nights, the enslaved leaders maintained vigilance, while simultaneously cultivating hope. Every glimpse of safety, every hidden path that led further from the plantation, strengthened their resolve. They became increasingly adept at living in the wilderness, their senses heightened, their minds sharpened by constant danger. The forest, once a place of mystery and fear, became a crucible in which courage, ingenuity, and resilience were forged. By the time the plantation authorities realized the scope of the escape, the leaders and their followers were already well on their way to establishing temporary independence. The revolt had not only been an act of immediate defiance, but a lesson in survival, strategy, and the human capacity to adapt under extreme conditions. Within the forest's shadowed depths, the enslaved had claimed a fragile autonomy, proving that even in the most oppressive circumstances, freedom could be pursued, even if fleeting, and that courage, intelligence, and unity could momentarily outmatch even the most powerful and cruel systems. The forest, which had once offered a fragile sanctuary, now became a theater of relentless pursuit. Plantation authorities were swift to organize, driven by fear, anger, and the need to reassert control over the rebellious, enslaved population. Mounted patrols scoured the outskirts while foot soldiers combed the underbrush, armed with muskets, machetes, and unyielding determination. Informants, both coerced slaves and opportunistic allies of the colonists, provided intelligence that narrowed the hunter's focus. Every rustle of leaves or snapped branch could betray a hiding place. Every night was fraught with the risk of discovery. The leaders of the revolt understood that the forest, their ally for so long, could now become a trap, and that survival required even greater ingenuity and vigilance than before. As the pursuit intensified, the psychological pressure on the fugitive group became almost unbearable. Hunger, fatigue, and exposure weighed heavily on bodies already pushed to the limits. Sleep was stolen in short, fitful intervals, always with one eye open, listening for the distant sound of human voices or hoofbeats. The leaders had to maintain morale, ensuring that despair did not fracture the group. Small disagreements or lapses in judgment could have fatal consequences. Each step required careful deliberation, choosing paths that concealed tracks, avoiding open clearings, and selecting moments to drink or forage without drawing attention. Every decision was a delicate balance between risk and necessity, survival and strategy. Betrayal loomed as one of the greatest threats. The enslaved were painfully aware that loyalty was fragile under the weight of fear and coercion. Rumors of rewards for information spread quickly through neighboring plantations and settlements. Even the most trusted allies could be swayed by promises of freedom, money, or reprieve from punishment. Leaders had to navigate these treacherous waters, weighing trust against caution, often using misdirection, deception, and subtle tests to discern who could be relied upon. Each betrayal, when it occurred, sent shockwaves through the group, forcing rapid adaptation and, in some cases, desperate flight to new hiding places. The fugitives faced not only human pursuers, but also the raw dangers of the wilderness. Steep ravines, hidden rivers, and dense undergrowth created natural hazards, while poisonous plants, venomous snakes, and predatory animals added to the constant threat. Yet these same challenges offered protection. The unfamiliar terrain confused pursuers and slowed their advance. The leaders skillfully used this duality, leading the group through paths that minimized exposure while exploiting the hunters' ignorance of the forest. Every crossing of a river, every climb of a ridge, and every concealment in a thicket became an exercise in ingenuity and courage, a testament to their deep understanding of the land they had come to depend upon. Despite their resourcefulness, the consequences of capture were severe and immediate. Colonial authorities had no patience for mercy. Historical accounts suggest that captured rebels were subjected to brutal punishments designed to instill fear and deter future insurrections. Executions were public, often gruesome, serving as a spectacle of power and retribution. Mutilation, whipping, and long imprisonment were common, intended to break both the body and the spirit. The leaders knew that any misstep could end their lives, and that their actions would not only affect them, but could provoke a wave of collective punishment against those left behind on the plantations. This awareness intensified the psychological burden, forcing them to weigh every decision with the gravity of mortal consequence. The pursuit also illuminated the stark contrast between courage and fear. Plantation militias were numerous and armed, yet fear of the unknown, the unpredictable knowledge of forest tactics, and the clever misdirection of the fugitives created tension even among the hunters. The leaders understood the art of psychological warfare. The mere possibility of ambush, hidden traps, or sudden resistance forced pursuers to move cautiously, slowing their advance and providing crucial moments of respite. Yet each successful evasion was a reminder that the forest's protection was temporary and that the relentless reach of colonial authority could strike at any moment. Moments of betrayal or capture often came suddenly, shattering the fragile equilibrium of the fugitives. Some groups were ambushed, others deceived by promises of safe passage, and still others fell victim to informants within their own ranks. The consequences were brutal. Lives were extinguished in ways that underscored the totality of the slave system's cruelty. Survivors were forced to witness these events, a grim reinforcement of the stakes, and a reminder that the forest, for all its protection, could not guarantee absolute safety. The emotional weight of seeing comrades captured or killed added another layer of trauma, forging resilience in some, despair in others, and unyielding determination in those who remained. Yet even in the face of these dangers, the leaders displayed extraordinary skill, intelligence, and foresight. They established secondary camps, hidden supply caches, and escape routes designed to mislead pursuers. Every decision was informed by prior experience, an acute understanding of human behavior, and an intimate knowledge of the natural environment. This strategic brilliance allowed some of the rebels to evade capture longer than authorities anticipated, preserving hope and inspiring those still in bondage with the possibility of resistance. The hunt, with its relentless intensity, underscored the high stakes of rebellion in a society built on terror and control. Each capture reinforced the risks, Each successful evasion highlighted the potential for ingenuity and courage to challenge oppression. The consequences of the revolt extended beyond immediate physical danger. It sent shockwaves through the plantation system, forcing slaveholders to reconsider their methods of control, increasing suspicion, and altering the dynamic of fear and authority. The enslaved, even those who remained unrebellious, could see the limits of absolute power and the potential, however fleeting, of defiance. By the end of this phase of pursuit, it became clear that the revolt had already left an indelible mark. Lives had been lost, alliances tested, and the social fabric of the plantation shaken. The forest, while offering temporary sanctuary, could not erase the reality of mortal danger, nor the profound consequences of rebellion. Yet within the terror and the bloodshed, the enslaved leaders' courage, cunning, and unbreakable will emerged as a powerful testament to the human spirit, capable of confronting tyranny even in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of their flight and pursuit illustrates not only the cost of resistance, but also the enduring legacy of those who dared to defy a system built to crush every spark of autonomy. The revolt, though suppressed, left echoes that would resonate far beyond the immediate violence and fear. Its memory persisted not in official records, which were often sanitized or distorted, but in whispers, songs, and oral histories carried from one generation to the next. Among the enslaved, tales of the leaders' cunning, courage, and defiance became stories to inspire, to teach, and to preserve the truth of resistance. Each retelling emphasized not just the act of rebellion, but the intelligence and bravery required to strike back against an overwhelmingly powerful system. In these narratives, the forest became a symbol not only of survival, but of hope, a space where ordinary people could reclaim agency, even if temporarily, and challenge the forces that sought to erase them. Oral traditions transformed the revolt into myth, blending fact with memory, memory with moral lessons. Songs carried coded meanings, recounting escapes, clever strategies, and acts of courage that historians might overlook. These cultural artifacts allowed communities to remember both the brutality of slavery and the resilience of those who refused to submit. Elders would whisper the stories to children, ensuring that even the youngest understood the price of oppression, the value of courage, and the possibility of defiance. Over time, the leaders' names became symbolic, representing the larger struggle of enslaved populations across Jamaica and the Caribbean. Their actions, though isolated in time and place, were woven into a broader narrative of resistance that transcended individual events and inspired continued opposition to bondage. At the same time, official accounts often framed the revolt in starkly different terms. Plantation records, colonial reports, and newspapers described the enslaved as criminals or conspirators, downplaying the human suffering and moral imperative behind their actions. These accounts sought to reinforce fear, deter future insurrections, and maintain the appearance of order. Yet the disparity between official narratives and oral histories underscores a critical point. The revolt's true significance lies not only in its immediate outcomes, but in how it challenged perceptions of power, morality, and resistance. The enslaved leaders were vilified in the eyes of the authorities, but celebrated in the memory of the oppressed, a contrast that highlights the complexities of history and the ways in which power seeks to define truth. The revolt also influenced the strategies of subsequent resistance movements. Knowledge of poisoning, stealth, and forest survival became part of a larger repertoire of rebellion tactics. Later insurgents could draw on the lessons of these leaders, understanding that meticulous planning, intimate knowledge of terrain, and careful coordination could tip the balance, even against numerically or militarily superior opponents. In this way, the revolt was not an isolated act of defiance, but a foundational episode in a continuum of resistance, a proof that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents shaping their destinies, even under the harshest conditions. Cultural memory extended beyond strategy into moral and psychological realms. The story of the revolt forced both enslaved and free observers to confront questions of justice, courage, and human dignity. It challenged the notion that submission was inevitable, demonstrating that even the most oppressive systems contain vulnerabilities that could be exploited. These narratives allowed communities to grapple with the moral complexities of rebellion, the necessity of violence for survival, the ethics of vengeance, and the enduring pursuit of freedom. By framing the revolt as both a historical event and a moral lesson, memory transformed it into a tool for reflection, education, and inspiration. In literature, folklore, and historical scholarship, the revolt gradually emerged as a symbol of defiance. Writers and historians acknowledged its audacity, portraying the leaders as intelligent, brave, and resourceful. The forest, poison, and escape became recurring motifs, emphasizing both the ingenuity and courage required for the revolt. Over time, these symbolic elements helped cement the story in collective memory, ensuring that it remained relevant not only as a historical account, but as a cultural emblem of resistance against systemic oppression. The emotional resonance of the revolt cannot be overstated. For descendants of the enslaved, it offered a source of pride and a connection to ancestors who had refused to be broken. For broader audiences, it revealed the stark realities of life under slavery, the ingenuity of the human spirit, and the lengths to which people would go to reclaim autonomy. The juxtaposition of fear, courage, intelligence, and sacrifice creates a narrative that is both dark and inspiring, highlighting the enduring tension between oppression and freedom, despair and hope. Even centuries later, the revolt resonates in conversations about justice, power, and human rights. It challenges modern readers and viewers to confront uncomfortable truths, the brutality that underpinned wealth and prosperity, the moral courage required to resist, and the lasting consequences of systemic violence. It reminds us that history is not merely a record of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experiences, emotions, and choices, where acts of resistance, however suppressed, continue to shape cultural memory and identity. The forest, which once provided literal sanctuary, now serves as a metaphorical space in the collective consciousness. It embodies the duality of fear and hope, danger and refuge, oppression and resistance. Through memory and myth, the revolt's leaders continue to speak to subsequent generations, their courage echoing across time. In remembering them, society confronts the moral complexities of history, the endurance of the human spirit, and the potential for ordinary individuals to enact extraordinary change, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. Ultimately, the legacy of the revolt lies not in the immediate victories or losses, but in the enduring power of human resilience. It is a testament to the capacity for strategic thinking, courage, and moral conviction in a world designed to suppress them. Its memory continues to inspire, educate, and challenge, ensuring that the shadows of the plantations are not merely dark reminders of cruelty, but also beacons illuminating the courage and resistance that refuse to be extinguished. The revolt, when viewed in its entirety, is a story of extremes, fear and courage, oppression and defiance, life and death intertwining in ways both horrifying and inspiring. The enslaved leaders who orchestrated the poisoning and flight into the forest demonstrated a remarkable blend of intelligence, audacity, and resilience. Their actions were born not from malice, but from the relentless pressure of systemic cruelty that had stripped them of autonomy, family, and dignity. The horror of the plantations had reached a point where rebellion was not only an assertion of freedom, but a moral imperative, a desperate yet calculated claim to the basic rights of human existence. Every act of defiance, every risk undertaken, carried consequences that were immediate, severe, and often deadly. Yet the enslaved pressed forward, motivated by a mixture of necessity, vengeance, and hope. Reflecting on the human cost of the revolt is essential to understanding its depth. Lives were lost on both sides, though the imbalance of power meant that the enslaved bore the brunt of the punishment. Those captured faced brutal reprisals, public executions, and mutilation designed to terrorize others into submission. Families and communities of the rebels were punished collectively, a cruel method of control meant to extinguish not just individual resistance, but the very idea of defiance. The psychological toll was immense. Grief, fear, and trauma were constant companions, shaping both survivors and witnesses alike. Yet amidst the suffering, the revolt revealed the extraordinary capacity of humans to endure and act decisively, even under circumstances designed to break the spirit. Courage manifested not only in the leaders' strategic planning, but in the small, everyday acts that made the revolt possible. Every whispered conversation, hidden gesture, and covert preparation demanded bravery equal to the poisoning itself. Each enslaved person involved had to navigate fear without hesitation, balancing instinct with calculation. Their courage was compounded by moral complexity. They understood that their actions could provoke violent retribution, yet they proceeded, driven by the urgent need to reclaim agency and assert humanity in the face of dehumanization. This form of courage, quiet and often invisible, laid the foundation for the dramatic and terrifying acts that unfolded on the day of the revolt. The forest, as both sanctuary and arena, becomes a symbol of resilience in this reflection. Within its dense canopy and shadowed undergrowth, the leaders and their followers enacted survival with extraordinary ingenuity. They navigated the terrain with skill, avoided capture through clever strategies, and maintained group cohesion under unimaginable stress. Their intimate knowledge of the land allowed them to outmaneuver more heavily armed pursuers, demonstrating that intellectual and strategic acumen could counter brute force. This interplay between human skill and environmental awareness emphasizes that the revolt was not merely an emotional reaction to oppression, but a calculated, intelligent, and highly disciplined resistance. The horror of the revolt is inseparable from its emotional resonance. Colonial brutality, systemic violence, and the severe punishments inflicted upon captured rebels highlight the stakes of defiance and the extraordinary risks taken by those seeking freedom. Yet, even amid terror, the revolt evokes admiration and awe for the human spirit. The ability to maintain composure, plan meticulously, and act decisively under such circumstances is a testament to both individual and collective strength. The leaders' ingenuity, courage, and determination continue to captivate, offering lessons in resilience, strategic thinking, and moral conviction that transcend time and geography. The revolt also compels reflection on morality and justice. The enslaved acted against a system that had stripped them of fundamental human rights, and their rebellion raises questions about the ethics of resistance, the morality of vengeance, and the responsibility of societies built on oppression. While their methods were violent, they were directed at those who had wielded violence and cruelty daily. The ethical tension embedded in these events forces modern audiences to consider the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions and challenges simplistic narratives of right and wrong. It demonstrates that acts of rebellion, however morally complicated, can carry profound significance as assertions of dignity, autonomy, and justice. Ultimately, the revolt's legacy is not measured solely in lives lost or victories won, but in the enduring narrative of human courage in the face of systemic oppression. The enslaved leaders, through their intelligence, bravery, and strategic foresight, left an indelible mark on history, showing that resistance is possible even under the harshest conditions. The horror they endured, the sacrifices they made, and the moral courage they exhibited ensure that their story resonates centuries later, offering lessons about resilience, agency, and the enduring struggle for freedom. This reflection brings the narrative full circle, reconnecting with the opening images of the plantations, the wealth, the cruelty, the oppression, and highlighting the stark contrast between the enslaved and their oppressors. The revolt, in all its horror and audacity, represents a moment where human dignity asserted itself against an unyielding system. It reminds viewers that history is not only about statistics or events, but about real people navigating unimaginable circumstances, making choices, and taking risks that echo across time. The revolt stands as a testament to the unquenchable human desire for freedom, the courage to confront injustice, and the profound consequences, both tragic and inspiring, of resisting oppression. In the end, the story leaves a haunting duality: horror intertwined with hope, brutality balanced by courage, despair countered by resilience. The enslaved leaders' actions, their flight, and the consequences they face serve as both warning and inspiration, a stark reminder of human cruelty and an enduring testament to the strength of the human spirit. Their revolt is a narrative that refuses to fade into obscurity, demanding to be remembered, studied, and felt, a powerful reflection on the costs of freedom and the lengths to which humans will go to claim it.